within the last 12 months, we now estimate that close to 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, and there are 300,000 to 400,000 Ukrainian casualties. And more than half of those casualties involve injuries that are so severe these men will never return to duty. And then you have to look at the Russian side. We estimate now 70,000 to 80,000 casualties and 20,000 to 25,000 dead. Now, the reason they're so disproportionate is that 75% of the losses on the Ukrainian side involve losses to artillery, missiles, rockets, drones, in other words, standoff attack weapons. And the Russians outnumber those weapons that the Ukrainians have by 10 to 1. So tens of thousands of artillery rounds are falling on human beings virtually every day across eastern Ukraine. And it's no wonder that the southern Ukrainian defense is crumbling and their casualties are mounting, and they have no way to stay there with any certainty and survive. So I think you're going to see a massive exodus north and west out of the Donbass, which of course is what the Russians want. But until Zelensky gives the order, thousands more will die needlessly in places like Bakhmut or Kupiansk or any number of places.
They've got American weapons, and we're a year into this war, and they have held the Russians at not just the Donbass, but the eastern part of the Donbass. The Russians aren't occupying too much more territory than the pro-Russian rebels were before the war broke out at this point, right? Well, other than, I guess I should say, the land bridge in the south to Crimea, of course.
Well, the Russians occupy 22 to 23% of the country. They're sitting on top of all the nation's industry and, frankly, 90+% of its gross domestic product. In other words, everything that produces income for Ukraine that's of any real significance is currently under Russian control. That's not really surprising because most of the people that lived there to begin with are Russians, and historically it was Russian. And that really is the only area that Putin was really interested in liberating from Ukrainian occupation and oppression. But I think we need to understand something, that when the Russians went in to begin with, they went in with a relatively small force on the assumption that demonstrating the seriousness with which they took what happened in Ukraine, their legitimate security interests, that we would respond with negotiations. It took a few months for the Russians to finally discover, well, the Americans are not only disinterested in negotiating, the Americans see this as an opportunity to fatally harm Russia. So the Russians went back, re-examined their options, and decided that they had to go to war. And it's taken them several months to prepare for what you call total war. I wouldn't go that far. I would just say high-end conventional war. And now they have hundreds of thousands of troops in Belarus, in Western Russia, and in southern Ukraine. And I think they're ready for it. The problem is that the winter was short. They only had about 2 or 3 weeks of frozen ground, which would have facilitated some maneuver, but it wasn't enough time in the estimation of the Russian high command to support major offensives that they want to succeed. And so they held back. And what we see now is the mud season. We have vehicles. I get video all the time from all sides showing me trucks and armored fighting vehicles mired in 6-7 feet of mud that they can't get out of. So for the moment, at any rate, the Ukrainians are being helped by the fact that there's no mobility. And the Russians can pursue them to a limited extent, but not to the extent they could if it were dry. Now, this mud is going to dry out, but it will probably take most of March and April for that to happen, which means we won't see the massive movement of forces until May and June. When that occurs, I think they'll rapidly sweep over eastern Ukraine, and I suspect they will then probably cross the Dnieper and start moving west, because one of their goals is to cut off the Polish border from Kiev and cut off Ukraine and its army from any further assistance from us.
Now, how difficult is it from here to keep track of how many brigades and divisions and this and that are left on, in these or those positions on this and that side?
Well, on the Ukrainian side, right now in eastern Ukraine, we estimate there are 16 brigades most of those are at 60 or 50 or 40% strength. And if you do the math and you start out with 4,000 in a brigade and you cut that manpower in half, you have an appreciation for the losses, which have been horrific. And they're starting to feed new recruits into the system. I sent you earlier a lengthy comment from people on the ground in Ukraine who are watching the Ukrainians bring in these new recruits. And these are overwhelmingly boys, 15, 16, some even younger, some women, and large numbers of older men in their 50s and 60s. And these people have almost no training, perhaps 2, 3, 4 weeks of familiarity with weapons and so forth, and they're being hurled into the breach. And now Ukraine still has a few so-called elite formations left that they've been holding in reserve, and I'm told now they're starting to funnel them as a last-ditch effort into what remains of Bakhmut. But the bottom line is the Ukrainians are now scraping the bottom of the barrel for people. In addition to those, you've got about 35,000, maybe a little bit more Ukrainian soldiers, officers training in Western countries that will eventually come back. They're supposed to have the training that's necessary to operate the more sophisticated equipment, because right now, anything like rocket artillery and your various radars, some of the logistics and the distribution system, the higher staffs, those are populated by NATO military manpower. And without that NATO military manpower, American, German, whatever, in Ukrainian uniform or simply unidentifiable uniforms, I think the whole effort would fall apart. So it's a tragic situation. Ukraine cannot win. It has no chance of winning. And you would think under the circumstances, someone with a degree of some humanity would intervene and say, enough is enough. The Ukrainians have done more than anyone could reasonably expect, and it's time for this to end. But no one in Washington wants to admit that they were wrong.
Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut, our troops are not being protected. And yeah, he says, if you go to the front, it's a 30 to 70 chance that you'll make it back at all. These people are being killed and, of course, blown to pieces, right, by artillery shells is what most of the fighting is. So it's just an absolute horror show going on over there. And this article is a really in-depth thing. The guy spent at least a few days at the front here interviewing different guys about.
Well, remember, Scott, that is a Ukrainian newspaper.
Yeah, and clearly a very pro-regime one. Yeah, it's not some
pro-regime. It's not pro-Russian. It's just telling you the truth.
Right. Yeah, and it's you gotta figure maybe some of the worst is left out, but what remains is really bad. And they're talking about essentially a big more. Good.
The other thing to keep in mind is the Ukrainians have already fired 1 million artillery shells. That doesn't include their use of drones and rockets and so forth. And now they're effectively running out. One of the points that the author of that article makes is that in most cases, they're getting no artillery support at all from their own side.
And the artillery they have is literally from World War II.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, the problem is everyone who looked at this war from the beginning is getting an education, because just about everybody underestimated, the amount of ammunition and the losses that would be taken. And people overestimated the effect of many weapons. And many of the weapons that we produced, we thought would be superstar performers, both German and American, didn't turn out to be that way. Mm-hmm. So everybody got something wrong on this. But right now, the people suffering are the Ukrainians. And the real question is, what's next? And I think next is collapse. And the question is, what do we do when this becomes clear? What do we do when the Russians break out and simply overrun all of eastern Ukraine? Are we going to go into this ourselves?
You know what?
Which is my great nightmare.
War is a government program. And so, the self-licking ice cream cone and all that. I mean, and in fact, I think we talked about this a year ago, that if the Russians succeed in taking the East, well, now what? Now they've left an enemy rump state dominated by the hardest right-wing Ukrainian nationalists in alliance with NATO and the Poles, that is going to be an even worse thorn in their side, or as an equal thorn in their side to the previous situation. So then they're just going to have to solve that problem. Then once they solve that problem, now they've just picked up 2 new NATO nations on their borders.
Well, that's right, and that's something they obviously wanted to avoid. But my supposition, and perhaps I'm wrong, but my supposition is that by the time they've closed on the Dnieper, the Europeans will say that's enough. And they don't want this sort of unrelenting insurgent warfare in Western Ukraine under any circumstance. It's very difficult to wage it there, to be blunt, because other than the Carpathian Mountains that are in the far west, the rest of Western Ukraine is largely open, rolling countryside. So that's a tough place to run an insurgency. It ends up becoming simply a set of targets on a daily basis for Russian standoff attack weapons. But I think the Europeans will oppose that because there's always the danger if this drags on, how long before it starts spilling into Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Lithuania. And the Russians aren't interested in that. They don't want it to go on. The Europeans don't want it to go on. Of course, there's always the outside possibility that someone in Washington, D.C. wakes up and smells the coffee. Mm-hmm. I think that is possible because now I'm beginning to detect this new groundswell to justify enormous defense spending by talking about the looming China threat. And you got to stop and ask yourself a question. If we're happy with what's happening in Ukraine, why are we now shifting the conversation to China?
Yeah.
And of course, the Chinese are many things, but they're certainly not a military threat in the way that they're being described. Far from it. I don't see any evidence for any Chinese interest in attacking the United States. I don't see any interest in the Chinese attacking Taiwan. In fact, we know that the Taiwan government and Beijing are constantly talking to each other on back channels. It's not going to be a war there. So why are we talking about suddenly China again? I think they're trying to change the subject in anticipation of everything falling apart in Ukraine.
Yeah.